we're going to switch into talk number 4 now, which is focused on parenting. So this is our last one for today. Hopefully you guys are still doing good and feeling engaged and willing to sit here for another 25 minutes or so. So this last mini talk is for parents, but like I said before, even if you aren't a parent, I think that the things that we're going to talk about here could still be helpful. And why did I want to have a whole 1/4 of what we're doing today focus on parents? And I think one is I am a parent, and my kids are 10, 8, and almost 6. And I mentioned I've already started having conversations like this with my 10-year-old especially, with all of my children to some degree, but especially my 10-year-old. And I'm seeing what she is exposed to in school. She's in public school. And I myself have a lot of questions. How do I parent well through this? And I've talked to a lot of other parents who are wrestling similarly. What do we do? And it's not just parents, it's grandparents, it's aunts and uncles. It's, I think, just really wrestling. How do we have conversations about this with our kids? How do we lead them well? So hopefully this will help answer some of that. So what do we need to do as parents? One, I would say that we need to teach our children what it means to be a boy or man or girl or woman made in the image of God. And I think this connects with things we've already talked about. We want to affirm to our kids that their bodies matter, that God designed them intentionally, that when they were formed in their mother's womb, God knew who they were going to be, and He wanted them exactly that way. I think that we can also help them understand that, the expressions of biological sex can change, but sex itself, our biological sex, does not change. So, and this connects with what we talked about previously with stereotypes and things like that. Just because a boy likes more stereotypically female things doesn't mean that threatens his boyhood, or likewise for a girl. And so if we can promote that consistency, like you can be boy while doing these things, you can be all girl while pursuing these things, then that's a message we can repeat over and over and over to them, that this is okay. Furthermore, I think we need to be, I think it's a Christian culture, a Christian group, we need to be better about teaching our kids worldview. It's hard for us, I think, as adults to sometimes even wrap our heads around it, but our kids are being confronted with worldview issues at a very young age. And if we are not teaching them explicitly how to think about the world and how to think about it biblically, they will fill it in with other things. And they may even, again, hold on to I believe in God, I believe He created the world, I believe Jesus came and He died. But if we're not teaching them how to explicitly work that out into the details of our lives and what that means for how we think about problems in this world, how we think about gender and sexuality, how we think about everything, then they will start to incorporate the philosophies and worldviews of the people around them and end up with that kind of fragmented view where there's some things that are biblical and some things that are just things that they've heard from other people. So when we're teaching our kids about a biblical worldview, we want to teach them that as God is our creator, He knows what's best for us. As our designer, He has the right, the authority. He is reliable to tell us what we were designed for. As the one who died for us, we know that we are loved by Him and we can trust Him. And as we help them to understand what a biblical lens on life looks like, then they will begin to see suffering and sin and purpose, all of the big questions that we wrestle with in our life through the lens of God is our creator, sin is our biggest problem, Christ paid the penalty for our sin, we are new creations, we found new life in Him, and that becomes the backdrop of how we think about everything else. Next, I think we need to make sure we are connecting relationally. One of the most important things that you can do, and if you're a parent, you know this, is to make time to just spend and be with your kids. Our culture is so overscheduled. Our kids are involved in 1,000 activities. They go from school to music lessons, to sports, to travel team, to Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and they're all great stuff. They're great activities. But it really decreases the amount of time that we have to spend with our kids just being with them and talking with them and giving them opportunities to explore bigger questions that they're wrestling with. If we want to have influence with them, we have to make time to do things our kids enjoy. We need to make time for intentional conversations. I find that when the pandemic hit, the first month or so in 2020, when it first started, my phone tracks my steps, and it was just so sad because I was like, I literally go from my bedroom downstairs to the coffee maker to the couch. I'm not moving anywhere. I'm in my house all the time. And I decided I was going to walk in the early mornings before my kids were awake. It was a way I could just get out of the house, move my body, and it felt good after being cooped up. And I've stuck with that, even though our gym membership is back up and we can do things outside of the house again. I've really loved walking in the early mornings. It's become a really sweet time with the Lord. But once a week, I try to bring my daughter along with me. She's an early riser. She likes to get up early. And I just thought, man, that's a time that I could really intentionally connect with her. And I find that when you're walking, it's easier to have hard conversations. Kids often won't sit down with you and just tell you what's going on in their life. Maybe yours does, but mine don't. And just give you that opportunity to talk through things. But when we're walking, all of a sudden, things just start to spill out. We get this really good dialogue going. And so, I think just be intentional. How are you connecting with your kids? How are you making time for hard conversations or important conversations or happy conversations to happen in our really overscheduled culture? And I want to make a point here too, because one of the things I think parents wrestle with a lot is education, right? Should you homeschool your kids? Should you send your kids to private school, a Christian school, or should you send your kids to public school? And once again, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I think that actually could be even the wrong question in terms of the primacy of it. I think that the most important question is, how are you as a parent, whatever way you educate your child, having intentional conversations with them, teaching them a biblical worldview? Because I was homeschooled. I love homeschoolers. I was homeschooled my whole way through. And my kids are in public school. I spent a lot of time with homeschoolers growing up, and I know a lot of people who homeschool now, especially since we're post-COVID world. And that does not guarantee that kids are thinking about the Bible, that they're applying the Bible to their lives. And so if that's your ultimate solution, that's not great. And the same thing with a Christian school. People could send their kids to a Christian school and feel like, well, they're getting a Christian education. They're learning about things from a biblical worldview. Well, maybe, maybe not. And once again, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily applying it. And if I'm expecting my kids to get what they need from public school, well, I'm definitely in trouble. So no matter what you do, you have to be a parent who is looking for, how can I be instructing, guiding, and walking alongside my children as they're wrestling with these issues and the things they're hearing. And even if they're homeschooled, it's guaranteed they're still hearing these conversations among their friends. So all of that to say, when I talk about the challenges with public school, my point is not that I think public school should be avoided. I actually think that it has provided a really great opportunity for me to talk to my kids about really important things. But I do think that we need to make the focus of what we are doing on not expecting that the education is going to be the solution. It's us as parents thinking through how to best bring the gospel to bear in our children's lives. With this in mind, I think it's important that we do not make a sexual ethic the foundation of our faith. Rather, our faith is the foundation of everything, including our sexual beliefs and practices. So do not make every intentional conversation you have with your kids about sex and gender, or the things they should not do, or drinking, or whatever it is. That's not the point. Raising a wonderfully moral child is a good thing. But again, if their heart is far from God, we have failed. And And I want to be careful there because I do think parents can do, pretty much everything right. We know parents who have been amazing Christ followers and have done a wonderful job raising their kids, but those kids sometimes still choose not to follow Christ. So it is ultimately not something that we are in control of. And yet, to the extent that it is in our control as parents, let us be people who are not making the goal of our lives creating moral children, but instead helping them become followers of Christ. Okay, so next point, we need to make sure that we are conversing about the gospel regularly. I love what Deuteronomy 6 says about this, just because I love the language of it. It kind of inspires me. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts." And here's where it gets really good. "Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." Now, some in the Jewish religion would take that literally and post scripture on their doorframes and say, like, I fulfilled what this is about. That's not my read of this. My read of this is the idea that Scripture, who God is, it needs to be such a significant part of our lives and our families that it's just pouring out everywhere. And talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. My kids sometimes will tease me and be like, "Yes, Mom, we know you're going to talk more about the Bible or tell us." And I actually love it when they do that. I do. And we have a good-natured relationship about it. They're not actually mad about it. They're just sort of like, "Yeah, Mom, we got it." But I hope that someday that's one of the things that they remember most about their childhood was like, man, Dad just always wanted to help us to think about how this relates to our faith. To the point that sometimes it was almost annoying, but I know their hearts were good. I hope they say that part. But I just want to be someone who is helping them think about the gospel all the time. How does it fit with their life? We are so easily distracted. And in our culture, probably more so than any other culture before, it takes a lot of intention to think about how to incorporate that into our daily lives. I also want to equip you with some resources that I think will help you think through these issues as a parent, or just even give you more information on the topic of gender overall. So I've brought some of them with me for those of you who are visual so you can see them. The first one, if you only read one book, I would suggest this one, Mama Bear Apologetics. There are two books. There's a regular Mama Bear Apologetics, and then there's this one, which is The Guide to Sexuality. I love these books. They're very conversational. They're very practical. They talk about worldview. And I really think this book in particular, it doesn't just talk about gender. It talks about sex positivity, pornography, same-sex attraction, purity culture. A lot of good stuff in this book that I think can be really helpful to thinking about how do I talk to my kids about these issues. Another one that I like is Preston Sprinkle's Embodied. I was just talking to someone in the break who was like, "Oh, what do you think about Embodied?" And I said, well, I don't agree with everything in this book, but I do like, he is someone who writes very, very compassionately about this issue. And so I have talked to people who do not see this issue the way that I do, people who are members of the LGBTQ community, and they have been able to converse around the way Preston Sprinkle writes. So they are able to read it and not be so angry and offended that they're actually willing to talk about it. And I think that's a really good thing for me. He does maintain a traditional view of sexuality and gender, but again, the way that he writes, I think, is just very, very compassionate and helpful. And so he talks about what the Bible says about gender. He also talks about research a little bit in this, the idea of can a male brain be in a female body, or a female brain be in a male body? And while I don't agree with everything he says, I have found him to be really helpful when talking to people. Another one is Gender Ideology by Sharon James, What Do Christians Need to Know? This is another really small book, so if you're looking for resources that are really short but give you an overview of how these issues are framed in our culture, this might be a good one. I told you I'm a big reader, so I'm sorry. There's a whole long list in your notes. I'm only covering 4, well, I brought in one extra one. But this one, I love this book. It's by Sam Allberry, What God Has to Say About Our Bodies. So this book is not about like gender specifically. That's not really his point. But it does give you a view, a theology of the body, a view of why our bodies matter to God. And he talks about gender a little bit in here. But when in our culture we tend to downplay the significance of the body, I think as Christians we need to think about how to answer that and how to talk about why we see things a certain way. And I just really love this book. So again, it's not super thick. And one that's not on your list that I wanted to mention is 10 questions every teen should ask and answer about Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin. So this book has chapters on, it does have a chapter on gender. It has a chapter, like it's things like, how can I live my best life now? Can Jesus be true for you but not for me? Can't we just be good without God? Can't we just agree that love is love? Does God care when we hurt? How can you believe the Bible is true? It is written towards adolescents. And in fact, my 10-year-old, who's also a big reader, I've let her read parts of this book as well when she's had questions like, how do we know the Bible is true? So I like it because if you have a teenager or a middle schooler who, is starting to ask a lot of questions, I think this book can help get the conversation started. It won't, perfectly answer everything, but if you each read a chapter together and then talk about it, it might be really helpful in your conversations. Okay, thanks for listening to me go on about books. The last one, 10 questions every teen should ask and answer about Christianity, Rebecca McLaughlin. Yes, and sorry it's not in the notes. I literally grabbed this one this morning. It was on my desk. I was like, I should bring this one too. Okay, so a couple other points that I want to make. I think that we need to be wise as parents, we need to be wise in the limitations and freedoms that we provide to our kids. So my thinking here is, this goes back to gender expression. We need to be careful that we are not trying to really rigidly limit what our kids should or should not do because they're a boy or a girl. I think that a better message for many areas, not all, but for many areas, is you can love that while fully being the sex that God has given you. But there may be times that there are lines that you need to wrestle with and think like, okay, is this right or God honoring for my child to pursue this particular thing as a boy or a girl? And I think that what helps us decide what to do is trying to get at the heart behind gender expression, right? And we talked about that earlier. So what is the child intending to accomplish? Are they trying to become the other sex, or are they just interested in something that is stereotypically aligned with the other sex? I think we can make some distinctions there. And just one more example of how we see this biblically, that stereotypes don't necessarily work as our best arbiter of what limitations we need to put on our kids. We have King David in the Old Testament. And in some ways, he is the picture of masculinity, right? He's someone who goes to battle, and he's a king, and he's a warrior, and he defeats Goliath, and he can wrestle with bears and win. So he has a lot of masculine qualities. But he was also very emotional. He penned many of the Psalms expressing anguish and grief and weeping and sorrow. He danced, he sang, he was a musician. He was a lot of things that we in our culture right now would say, well, that's not really how we think about men. And God seems to be pleased with the Psalms and the dancing and all of those things. It doesn't say, oh, men don't do that. So I think that we just need to be careful when our kids are trying to figure out, or we're trying to help our kids figure out how to live in such a way that is honoring to God, that we're not imposing restrictions that the Bible does not actually impose on them. Okay, another point, social media. I think that on this issue in particular, we need to know and be aware of where our kids are getting their information from. We know that there's a particular vein of gender dysphoria called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which has a little bit of a different trajectory than a typical gender dysphoria. And it is what it sounds like. So most of the time with someone who has gender dysphoria, they show signs of that from early on. So even as a preschooler, maybe they seem drawn towards the interests of the opposite sex. Rapid onset gender dysphoria seems to happen mostly in girls, and it seems to happen seemingly out of nowhere. Parents of a girl who says, I'm transgender, it may be middle or high school, be like, I've never seen anything like this. Like, she always wanted to be a girl. There was never any wrestling with this. And then all of a sudden she told me she's a boy. And in those particular cases especially, we know that social media seems to have an impact on them going in that direction. Peer groups as well. Sometimes multiple kids in a peer group could all decide together, we think we're actually boys. And so I just think we need to be more cognizant of what our kids are being exposed to on social media, on YouTube. Who are they listening to? Where are they getting their information from? It's amazing to me how easily we as parents are willing to just give our kids technology that exposes them to the World Wide Web and all of the ideas on it, and not even aware necessarily of what they're listening to or where they're getting that from. One more book I wanted to mention is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. She is not a Christian, but she talks about that rapid onset gender dysphoria. And so if you are a parent of girls, teenage girls, middle school girls, or younger girls, and you want to think about this, I think that it's an important book because it does help us to just think about what influences in particular our girls might be wrestling with, struggling with. Okay, my last point, and then I will be done. If you are a parent and you are trying to figure out, how do I parent well? What does it look like to help my kid think about these issues? I really think that the most important piece of advice that I could give you is this: prioritize your own personal commitment and devotion to Christ. If you want to lead your kids well, if you desire to help them view the world rightly, to view it biblically, they can spot hypocrisy a mile away. So if you tell them, we're Christians and we believe this, and you're not living it, or your heart is not devoted to Christ, they see that, and they may not articulate that to you. They might not even know how to articulate that, but they see it. And so, if you're concerned about this, if you're like, man, I want to make sure that I lead well as a parent, prioritize your own commitment to Christ. Devotion to Christ does not guarantee that your children will follow him. I mentioned that before, but we want the genuineness of our faith to shine through our interactions with them. We want to live in such a way that even if they struggle or push back, that if and when they decide to pursue Christ personally, that they want to tell us about us. They want to tell us about it. They want to say, Mom and Dad, I decided I'm going to follow Jesus, and not feel so awkward about that because of the way we've lived it out in front of them, that they don't even want you to know that they finally decided to do it. I love Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. It says, and this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. I love this prayer that our love may be filled with what? With knowledge and depth of insight. Remember, love and truth go together. The way that we love is by standing firmly on truth. So may our love abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight. Why? So that we may be able to discern what is best and be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. And that is my prayer for me, for my husband. That is my prayer for all of us here, that our hearts would be oriented so much towards Christ that whether it is with this issue or other issues that we encounter in our world, that we are just in pursuit of love with truth, to be able to discern what is best and be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Amen.